Well, it's not often you get to interview somebody who is that you greatly admire and who is also a close friend for a long time now, isn't it? Yeah, a couple of decades. So, um, so just a word or two about Kathleen Shields. After a very brilliant undergraduate career here in Trinity, Kitty went on to do a PhD in Cambridge. And after completing the PhD, she worked in Paris and in Caen. She taught in universities there. Then went to work as a senior editor on the Oxford Hachette Dictionary project. Eventually returning to Ireland to teach French and translation studies in Maynooth University, and see a lot of Maynooth colleagues here tonight. So she was someone I know from meeting a lot of your former students, Kitty, just how much they were impressed and shaped by your teaching activities over the years. A number of years ago, I had a great pleasure in launching one of Kitty's monographs, Games in Translation, Language, Poetry and Identity in 20th Century Ireland, which was a book that, among many other things, looked at the engagement of Irish poets with the translation of French poetry. So it seems kind of appropriate that in this kind of retrouvaille this evening, that we're again looking at a poet, but this time it's an Irish translator engaging with a French poet, and quite an encounter it is. Kitty, I wanted to, I suppose, start off with what is the question that many people would ask is, how did you discover this remarkable book? Because, I mean, Kitty will read extracts from it later, but it is an extraordinarily vivid portrait of a city. There's a very famous film by Walter Ruttmann, Berlin Symphony of a Metropolis, a film from 1927, where he gives you this kind of symbolic description of the day in the life of the city. And so you get with Follain this amazing kind of this sense when you're reading it that you're there in the city, you're walking around the city. So how did you come across this?
Yeah, well, it was kind of serendipity. I realized I taught a course for first-year students called 20th Century French Poetry and Song, and I let the students choose any poem from 1900 to present, or a song. And at that stage, I think I'd read Follain in anthologies, but kind of forgotten about him. And I didn't know Follain at all. And having spent a whole career lecturing in French literature and poetry, I only discovered him really by chance through a friend from Normandy who's possibly watching on Zoom, Brigitte Lejouet, said to me, "Oh, you're interested in Kieran Carson, and he's done this interesting book of translations of Jean Follain called From Elsewhere." So I was working on 2 conference papers about Carson's translations of Follain. And one of them was during the pandemic. And I got distracted away from Carson down a kind of a Follain rabbit hole, where, first of all, I found this book, Paris, which was available online. So I read it as an ebook. And then there were no more Follain books available electronically. So I felt a bit guilty about buying all these French books on Amazon. I decided I'd order a case of Follain from Mola, who is a really, really good bookseller in Bordeaux, where I'd already found brilliant collections of detective fiction. Anyway, Mola, if you're ever ordering a book from France, go to Mola, I would say. They're better than Fnac. They have an amazing website. They do online sales. So they also had far more Follain in stock than Fnac did, which was weird. Anyway, I ordered about 8 books by Follain, poetry and prose, everything that Mola had in stock. A giant box came one day during the lockdown, and I worked my way through them, and I found him. I could see why Carson was drawn to him. Kieran Carson said the poems have these extraordinary, mysterious landscapes, which are sometimes haunted by ghosts. They're very mysterious poems. They make the reader work, and they leave the reader guessing. So that was the poetry. And I did a paper online about Carson and Follain, and then I prepared another one about the poetry. But I thought, this is weird. No one has translated the prose. A lot of Americans were very drawn to Follain's poetry. I think Christopher Middleton did 130 Follain poems. He's an English poet with Anvil Press. But the Americans seem to like translating him. I thought at first I was a bit, I thought, is it because it looks easy on the surface? But I think it's because they have this tradition of poetry translation workshops that we don't really have this side of the Atlantic. And so Americans had translated the poetry, and 2 American women, Mary Feeney and Louise Guiney, had done excerpts of Follain, bits of prose and bits of poetry. But no one had translated Paris in its entirety, only small passages. So I thought I would just tip away, try it out. I thought, well, why has no one translated this book? This is weird. I read it in a weekend in French, and I thought, I read it very fast. And I thought, it's a beautiful atmospheric book. It's sometimes disturbing. There's cruelty and injustice in it. And then I thought, there's a bit of nostalgia in it as well. He's a bit of a young fogey, maybe. He was only 32 when he wrote it. But then I thought, I'll give it a go. I'll try translating a bit of it and see how I get on. So I got caught up in translating it then. So it was really serendipity, really a contact with a friend who suggested I look at Carson, and then through Carson, I discovered the reality of Follain himself. So.
He was somebody who studied law and eventually, goes on to become a judge. Do you think that is there something in his legal background that he has this sort of forensic intelligence? He's like a good cop. He's scanning the room every time he sits down to see if there's potential clues. Is he? When he's going around and also the fact that he notices things. He notices, pimps. He notices petty crime. He's kind of alert to things. Is that? Do you think that?
Yeah, I do think he had a parallel career as a lawyer. When he studied in Caen, he did law. He studied law. He didn't study literature, and he was a brilliant law student. He won prizes as a law student. But when I was in Caen, the law students tended to be very conservative and right-wing. And anytime there was a strike, the law students broke the strike. And they went around in, dark suits. And they weren't very radical, let's say. But Follain was different. Caen must have been different then, because there was a bunch of them. Well, we had a friend in college who later became a famous sociologist. And I think that friend was an important friend for him, Georges Duveau, who wrote a big book about the working class in the 19th century in France. And Follain and his friends, including, I think, Georges Duveau, they had this dream of being bohemian poets. And they had a dream about Montmartre, and they romanticized Montmartre. So even in college, he had this kind of dual career of bohemian poet and, forensically hard-working lawyer. You know, he was, so when he's in Paris, then you see all of human society is there, and there are criminals and people who are exploited. He sees injustice a lot, and especially in the treatment of women. He's very, he's got an awful lot of empathy for the women in Paris. And he zones in on really strange, he's a bit of a sociologist's eye, I think. He doesn't really get involved in politics. He kind of describes society as he sees it. And he uses the term class-related terms an awful lot to describe people, like he talks about le moraliste petit bourgeois, or les filles bourgeoises, or les artisans, or so he describes people in terms of their social class, their income, but not in a dismissive way, just to sort of locate them on the map of Paris. Yeah. And when he started in Paris, it was a bit of a struggle for him. He was very disillusioned about Montmartre and the literary scene. Montmartre was no more, really. When he arrived there in 1924, it was kind of pretty well over. But he knew some people, like some poets who'd been in the Bateau de Lavoir with Picasso and people like that. But he was a trainee barrister in a law office at the same time as trying to launch a career in journalism. So he wanted to be a legal correspondent or crime. He wrote for magazines, and he wrote for one in Belgium, in Brussels. So he had like three different careers on the go, but none of them was going very well through his 20s. One was a poet, writer, one was journalist, and one was lawyer. His first job in Paris, his parents had secured him a position in an insurance company, and he hated it, and he left after a few days. So he did live a fairly hand-to-mouth existence, I think, in the beginning. But once he found his little group of friends, Max Jacob was one, very important one, Armand Lubin, and he took off then from there. So in Paris, it's the three careers. He published it. It was his first book-length prose publication. He had a small book of poetry a couple of years before. In Paris, those three careers fused together: the journalism, the poetry, and the law. So it's very hybrid kind of writing. It's kind of writing that you find now, you know. Would you call it, I don't know what you'd call it, city writing?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, that's very
flaneur type literature.
Yeah. That's very striking about it. It's just the sheer kind of vividness and the freshness and the modernity of the writing itself. I'm just thinking of you mentioned, you know, his law studies in Caen, and the fact that he was that's where he starts. And I'm just wondering about, you know, somebody like Follain as a provincial arriving in Paris. I mean, Jean-Yves Dadier, the great Proust biographer, argues that basically French literature, for most of its existence, was the creation of provincial writers. It was Ronsard, Bellay, Stendhal, Balzac, Flaubert, all people who came to the provinces to Paris. So do you think is that he can see Paris in the way that many Parisians can't, because basically they spend their entire life in the 4th or the 5th or the 13th or the 19th arrondissement, and they rarely stray out of their own.
Yeah.
Do you think is that?
That's a very good point. Yeah, because the book starts with the person approaching the earth, bursting out from the asphalt, and the earth under the paving stones of Paris, and plants trying to grow up from the earth. And then he talks about coming in through Paris, through the suburbs, in this kind of transitional space. And at the end, I only realized this yesterday, the second last chapter is called Banlieues, the suburbs. So it recedes from Paris, goes back through the suburbs, and he's looking back from Fontenay, aux Roses and he describes the kitchen gardens and the little beets, the beetroot popping out of the soil and their green leaves. So it's framed in the city emerges from the countryside, and he goes back to the countryside at the end. And Balzac is an important forebear in the book, yeah. Not Baudelaire, really. Balzac and Apollinaire, I think, are the two spirits, the two writers that he mentions. And he mentions Rastignac a few times. And Rastignac is the provincial hero in Balzac who comes and stands and looks down on Paris and says, yes, one day, I don't know, what is he? I can't remember the quote, but yeah, he does see it with an outsider's eye. And in the 30s, an awful lot of people came. There was huge immigration into Paris from the provinces after the First World War. So an awful lot of the characters in Paris are from Le Berry, a lot of people from Brittany, a few people from Normandy like himself. There's an awful lot of other provincial people who are running cafes or working in the police, or so he has an affinity for other people who are from the provinces as well. So yeah, it's interesting. There was a time of great transition in Paris. So there's a lot of immigrants from abroad as well. It's quite cosmopolitan. So there's Jewish salesmen in the cafes, and there's the black cabaret artist in the Rocher de Cancale, and there's a lot of mixing up. He talks vaguely about Semitic people. I don't know what he means. You have to leave it vague, but it's very, it's very much a city where people come in from the provinces. Yeah.
I mean, you've talked about the kind of presiding deities from Balzac's very important, Apollinaire as well. What about the surrealists themselves? I mean, because Breton with Nadja, Argan with Le Paysan de Paris, these are where people are kind of moving around the city. That's part of, and a lot of his imagery, the kind of the writing itself has got these kind of juxtapositions, the kind of startling juxtapositions you tend to associate with the surrealists. But do you think that there was a bit of a distance from him?
Yeah, well, that's what all the French literary histories say about Follain, was that he avoided the path of surrealism. But that doesn't mean to say he wasn't a modernist. And I mean, I don't know if Apollinaire is really a surrealist, although Apollinaire invented the word surrealism in 1917 when he was writing the preface to the Mamelle de Tiresias. But they always say that about Follain and his group of poets, like André Salmon and people like that. They always say, oh, they were separate from the surrealists and they deliberately chose not to be surrealists. But I think we have an idea that maybe it's because now everybody is very polarized and everything's very black and white, but we have an idea that people went around in little bands. The surrealists never talked to other people. But actually, Follain defended Aragon in a law case against Gallimard, and Gallimard became Follain's own publisher the rest of his life. He knew Éluard personally. So I think it was much more mixing. I mean, I suppose if you look at your own contemporaries, you mightn't hang out with them all the time, but they're definitely, it's kind of not very helpful to say he didn't follow the path of surrealism, because it doesn't really say what path he did follow. But another thing people always say about Follain, and Kieran Carson says it about the poetry, is that he doesn't use metaphors or similes. He doesn't use any figurative language. But I think he does things figuratively in another way. And you're saying the startling contrasts. think what it is, he almost uses like a film editing technique. He'd have cuts, which he got from Apollinaire, startling juxtapositions of things, unexpected things put together. Usually 3 things in the poems, like there'd be geological time, then there'd be a little human incident, like a mini short story, and then suddenly there'd be a focus on an insect or something. And there's nothing connecting the 3 parts. The reader has to work out the connections. But the prose is more kind of easygoing, like there's little anecdotes, there's bits of dialogue. It's like there's mini short stories in there. In fact, I was thinking, if you were a novelist and you were looking, you couldn't start your novel, you could read this book because it would give you so many first line situations. It would give you so much, it would give you a lot of starting points for a novel. It's like there's loads of mini buds or mini short stories, or what they sometimes say, the French writers about Follain sometimes say micro-narratives, micro-récits, mini narratives. Yeah.
You were describing his, the time that he spends in Montmartre. He's kind of, he's a bit disappointed. He's arrived a bit after the fact because, of course, the time when he's in Paris, really, the center of energy is shifting to Montparnasse. It's moving from Montmartre to Montparnasse. But of course, Montmartre is primarily a center of the visual arts, and I kind of wondered about those sort of visual influences on Follain, because when you've got people like Pissarro or Degas, or kind of and I suppose Baudelaire before that, and his interest in the visual. I mean, we're beginning to look at capturing the city, and there's some of the descriptions. There's I think it's he's describing a Freemason where just the language they used to describe so the Freemason topographer has a long, fine blonde beard, rumblings caused by badly fried food, constantly growling his intestines. His black overalls against the pewter counter where he's drinking, next to the cream dress worn by an unknown, curious passing customer, combine a subtly harmonious composition, similar to the different complex flavors that strong wines can acquire at the day's end. I mean, this tends to be a kind, he almost has this painterly view of. I mean, do you get any sense?
I agree. Yeah, that's like a collage, isn't it? The cream dress of the woman passing the counter, and the pewter, and there's a lot of yellows and golds, and there's a little passage there we might look at if we've time.
Absolutely.
About the Foire du Trône, and it talks about the pylons and the sparkling dust. There's a lot of golds, and then storms brewing over Paris. So there's dark light, and then there's reds and yellows. He married a painter, Madeleine Vinesse, and she was the daughter of a painter. I think he got on quite well with his father-in-law. His name was Maurice Denis. He was one of the nabis who were quite mystical painters. And so I don't know if he ever did any painting and drawing himself. Claire Follain has done a huge fat book of his diaries, of his desk diaries. And so there's a lot of little cartoons and doodles and drawings in the desk diaries, and she reproduces a few of them. But I think the more I look at him, the more I think he's using also kind of filmmaking techniques and photography. There's a camera eye sometimes following. There's lists of things that the eye pans over. It is pretty visual, but the other thing that was very hard to translate in the book was the olfactory. Because there's a lot of different words for synonyms for smell in French that it's hard to do in English. All you end up saying is smell. But it was like arôme, relent, parfum. Yeah, there's a lot of. It's not just a visual camera eye. It's not just. there's a lot of there's quite a lot of taste in it too, like the wine at the end. He's talking about bouillon, you know, rich stews, and plat du jour, food figures a lot as well. So yeah, the visual is important. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I'll come up to the question of translation in a moment, but before I wanted to ask you. You talked about the micro-récits, so the micro narratives, and I was thinking as well. I mean, do you think he has a place in a kind of the history of micro travel in fact, because you know, Xavier de Metz would, you know, travels around my bedroom, so you know, he's literally sort of takes his bedroom as this kind of incredibly perilous journey when you get out of bed in the morning and you get as far as the chest of drawers and they go wash and basin. It's basically a teenage diary, you know, and then how long and difficult this is. But and then, you know, Georges Perec, the infraordinary, you know, he sits in the same cafe day after day and just records everything. So you see him as kind of part of that thing?
Yeah, I do. I actually went to that cafe where I went on a little scout around some of the Follain places. I thought I need to do a bit of field work, and I hadn't been in Paris for 3 years. And I went there last May, and I actually, went to that cafe where Perec sat there looking. Follain moves around a fair bit, much more than the other guy, the 18th century man, and Perec. I do think there's, he does fit into that very well, into that tradition, because he talks about the hills of Paris. He loves going up onto the hills. The hills attract him. The Butte Chaumont, which is near a street that he mentions all the time, the Rue des Envierges. And he talks about the Chaillot, the hill of Chaillot, Montmartre, Montparnasse, all the 7 hills of Paris. And there's one where he's up on a hill. I think Rastignac is looking down on from Père Lachaise. Anyway, one place he's on a hill and he takes out he's not there. It's Le Flâneur, or the observer, who's always mentioned impersonally, takes out this old naval telescope and looks down into the city of Paris from this hill. And with the old naval telescope, they can see, you know, the slum districts where the criminals live, or the towers and spires. But then there's bits that the telescope can't reach. And the narrative takes us beyond that into, it's kind of an amazing sentence. It zones in on micro details, like it takes us to the muck and the lilies of Paris, or the hand holding the evening newspaper, or the gloved hand turning the doorknob. And so it is that travel, vertical travel is there. And then there's microscopic travel. I think you're talking about Follain being a lawyer and very precise as a lawyer. And as a lawyer, he puts the evidence down on the paper and leaves the reader to decide. But also there's the element of, there's a scientific side to him. He sort of describes his Third Republic education with all these encyclopedias and globes, and all these images come back in his poetry a lot as well. The encyclopedia and the globe, and this kind of universal knowledge. And his father, I think, was taught in the college in Saint-Lô as a science teacher. And so he's obsessed with microflora, tiny little plants and tiny little animals, and dust and microscopic particles, flour and bits of human skin. All these things, tiny little things, appear a lot in the book as well. So that's kind of micro travel.
And it's also something seems to, again, stress the kind of the utter contemporaneity of the text, is that one of the things in the ecological crisis is talk about this problem of scalar literacy. On the one hand, you've got the kind of the movements in the sky, kind of weather events that are kind of global weather events, and then there's the face of microscopic organisms. So he has this kind of, he's attuned, or he's a sensitivity to the more than human world, which is very much what is part of the contemporary movement for deep mapping of things.
Yeah, he does. He sees things in terms of well, he's a bit like he sees things in terms of geological time in really, really long duration, and then the human battles and empires and that are like a smaller scale of time, and then he moves into his own times. Yeah, so and then he moves into the lifespan of microorganisms or animals or people who have shorter lives. So he's not human-centered. He probably is a humanist, but he doesn't see human beings are not at the center of his world. That's for sure. Yeah.
Judy, you mentioned there the question of the translation of different sensations and flavors, and I was struck when and this comes early on in the book. You're talking about the little cobbler. You know, there's a little cobbler that turns up in the early pages, and then you translated, "Nobody will see his likes again." And I was thinking, Follain, come off the pin, you know, and you know, and Flann O'Brien, and you know, all of a sudden this whole pantheon of Irish literary greats emerged from the face, and I said, "Nobody will see his likes again." And so I thought, is this a form of kind of guerrilla translation, kind of smuggling in your Hiberno?
Interesting. I see. I must go back to what the original was there. I'm good. It's the first chapter. I might check that. There was another bit. When I read the American translations, I thought, oh God, these are written in American English. And they were very American, you know. They were talking about streetcars and things, and of the poems, you know, and even the little bits of prose that Feeney and Guiney did. I thought they're so American. But I thought I try and pitch this not in too much of a regional English, because it's not written in regional French. But I did find myself using kind of Irish expressions, and there was un beau brin de fille I had written down. She used fine broth of a girl, and I thought, oh, jeepers, I can't put that in. I edited that out. But so I think maybe,
a girl.
yeah,
A broth of a boy.
Yeah, a slip of a girl. I think maybe that one was a bit unconscious. I don't know how many other Irish intertextuality is there. Yeah, it's interesting. I'll have a look and see what that was in the French. I will. I think is it in the first chapter?
It's very early on in the book. Anyway.
Yeah. I'll find it later.
Yeah, you'll find it.
Yeah. But yeah.
I suppose sort of more generally, just this question of, you know, one of the famous problems that translators find when working from French into English, and happens with the other Romance languages as well, is how to mix the abstract and the concrete. That English, there's that kind of empirical pull, and that sometimes with trying to capture certain words that are extremely resonant in French, like sol or terre, or, you know, can be very banal when they go into English, or, you know,
yeah.
Was that a problem?
Was it a problem? I found the difficulty was more to do with the sentence structures, that you can do much more. I find you can do much more complex sentence structures in French than you can in English. And there's this thing that French call l'ordre canonique de la phrase anglaise, which is subject, verb, object, complement, full stop. And then it goes on and on and on, and then it's just added together with buts and ands. Whereas French can do loads of prepositional subordinating clauses. So Follain sent to capture the enormous sweep of time and shifts in scale. Follain has this very unusual way of writing sentences. They're very long. Sometimes there's a list of a few things in the middle, and then there's a few relative clauses. The startling thing about his writing, well, that was very hard to do in English, I found. I found myself just tacking bits on with the preposition with. I thought that won't work. But I kind of found a way of doing it, because, well, I showed a little bit of it to a French friend, and she said, "Oh yeah, it's like a lot of those modernist writers of the 30s, maybe a bit like Joyce. The prose is a bit bancal," she said, a bit kind of lopsided.
Yeah.
So I was trying to get the strangeness of Follain's French as French. You know, I was trying to keep the strangeness of his own particular French, how it differed from standard French sentence structure. So he just separates the bits of the sentences with commas, as if they're like breath marks. They're not really, it's oddly punctuated, and I think he got that from Apollinaire, maybe. And it was interesting, about my 9th proofread of it, I decided, I'll try and see if my punctuation is like his, or if my sentences are as long as his sentences. So I read through it for that, and I noticed that Follain was more orthodox at the beginning of the book. He has more semicolons separating the bits of the sentence, and then as he gets carried away in the book, he just uses commas to separate things. But I found there were words like réverbération for light. I found that very hard to translate into English. How I was tussling over that. And then there were other really detailed words to do with techniques of wood carving or artisanal skills, very precise vocabulary, technical vocabulary of artisan skills. Like this word chantourner, which is, it just ramifies into different translations in English. It means like when you're doing wood carving, you chisel out the bits around, and then you have an image in the center when you've chiseled it out. So I just thought, I ended up writing things like chiseled, but it was a bit, I felt, you know, and then sometimes he talks about a pulpit being chantourné, which is like curved and smooth. And he talks about the table at an aperitif, you know, a table in a cafe being chantourné. And lamp standards are also chantourné. You know, his word I found very hard to translate. So specific technical vocabulary maybe was hard, but mostly it was the sentences, just keeping the flow of his sentence. That was the biggest challenge of all.
Yeah, which you do remarkably well in the translation. It's called Paris 1935, and you know, one thing as a reader, I mean, it's inescapable because you have this kind of foreknowledge. You know what's going to happen, that the Nazis will turn up, the Veldiv will happen, that Jacob will die in Drancy, and I mean, was there any sense when you're working through the translation that this kind of sense of foreboding, like this beautifully described world, you know, and all this kind of richness and its multiplicity, and these terrible things are going to happen to it?
Yeah. He doesn't have any sense of foreboding when he's writing it. I know I was trying not to think of that too much, because I kept thinking about, you know, he said about Saint-Lô, about the town, the chef-lieu. It was completely flattened by the Allies in 1944. And he wrote to a friend, he said, le chef-lieu n'est plus. Something about, je crois que la capacité des choses à durer a été complètement vaincue, or something. The ability of things to endure has been completely destroyed. And I suppose I was translating that while I was thinking of Aleppo and Mariupol and flattened cities. I'm thinking, God. But I thought, well, he wrote that to the friend in 1944, not in 1934 when he wrote the book. So I'm trying not to put too much into that. You know, I can't put that back into the book because it didn't happen. You know, he didn't know it was going to happen.
Yeah. What he has, there's kind of melancholy in
there is, but
joy, you know.
Well, the melancholy comes from the First World War, I think, because he was born in 1903. You know, the First World War divided his life into a before and an after. And in Paris, he hasn't really got over the First World War, which destroyed a lot of lives around him when he was growing up. And that's why he always went back to that childhood world in all of his writing. and the rural crafts and trades of Normandy. And he brings that into Paris then. And then he talks about the widows with young children. So most of Paris had moved on in the 1930s. Most of Paris had forgotten about the First World War. They were moving on, but he hasn't forgotten about that war. So I think that's the source of the melancholy. Yeah.
And yet it's so much joy in the book as well, because it's about capturing these kind of this instantaneous glimpses of happiness and of people. With the kind of thing when you're the flaneur, you're wandering around the city and you happen upon these instances of joy as well. Kitty, would you be willing to give us read an extract or two, just to give an idea of what an extraordinary text it is, and just how effective the translation is of the.
Yeah, I'll have to take a glass of water. But so, do you want me? Will I read it in French or English or?
Yeah, well, read in French first, and then in English.
Yeah. Okay. So, he's describing a fun fair, the Foire du Trône, in Paris, and all the lion tamer and the ringmaster and everybody there. And then, so I'll read a bit in French first. I'll just read a very short bit. Le ciel s'emplit de réverbérations jaunes. L'orage couve sur Paris. Le sang bout dans le corps épanoui de jeunes filles qui font de lourds efforts et pincent leurs lèvres pour garder un calme à leur visage. La nièce du dompteur sourit. Les fauves dans leur cage regardent distraits les grosses mouches qui se posent sur les déchets de viande brune. Dans la prunelle grise du flâneur, sertie dans le blanc d'œil, traversée de petits filets de sang, s'inscrivent en une belle composition terrestre, la ménagerie avec ses panneaux figurant des voyageurs attaqués par les tigres, les montagnes russes que décorent de grands chevaux neigeux ferrés d'or, la boutique blanche et rose où sont suspendus les écheveaux de guimauve, le visage cuivré de la gitane jeteuse de sorts. Seul, avec son chapeau de paille, au milieu des foules, le petit bourgeois moraliste épie des cœurs luxurieux et glacés. Right, that's a little sample in French. And I have marked, I have the same passage, well, a version of the passage. So there was the word réverbération. The sky takes on a yellow tinge. A storm is brewing over Paris. Blood boils in the bodies of young women in their prime as they tighten their lips in a great effort to appear calm. The lion tamer's niece smiles. The wild animals in their cages are distracted by the big flies that settle on offcuts of brown meat. The observer's grey eye, set in its eyeball, veined with tiny red lines, captures a beautiful earthly composition. The menagerie's painted panels showing travellers being attacked by tigers, roller coasters decorated with big showy horses with golden shoes, the pink and white stand where strips of marshmallow hang, the gypsy fortune teller's copper face. Alone in his straw hat among the crowds, the lower middle class moralist secretly studies cold, sensual human hearts. Let's stop there. That's a sample.
Great. Thank you very much, Kitty. I always identify with that lower middle class moralist. I think it has me pinned. So I'd like to ask Charles to say a few words now, who's produced this beautiful book. I mean, the book itself is magnificent, because very often you can do great work as a translator only to see the receptacle not quite match up to the contents. But in this case, it really is a very, very fine production. So, Charles, do you want to say a little bit about from your point of view as a publisher?
There's more serendipity going on here. I'm up here because I think this is a microphone. It might fit here. more serendipity. There's something collegiate and communal going on here. I've long admired the poetry of Jean Follain, and I actually got in touch with Christopher Middleton when he was working on his translations all that time ago, saying I'd like to publish these, but he promised them to Peter J. Anvil. Kieran Carson got to Follain through Kieran Carson, didn't he? I think. And you got to Follain partly through your friend in Normandy and also
Carson, yeah.
Carson. And I got to Follain partly through Christopher Reid, who's poetry editor at Faber, who published an American poet called August Kleinzahler. This has and his first book published by Faber has a book called Follain's Paris in it, which in fact was based on a translation, a very informal, rapid translation that Kleinzahler in Paris found the Paris book and said to his girlfriend, I'd like this book, translate it for me. And she did. And he mined that translation for his poems. Carson got to Follain through Ponge.
Yes, he did. Yeah.
That's right. And I got to Ponge again through Christopher Reid, who published some Francis Ponge translations, which Faber let go out of print, idiots, when Christopher left. And then Christopher met a French-Canadian woman who was translating Ponge just for the fun of it, just to exercise her muscles, and suggested she send them to me. Anyway, I've long wanted to publish Follain. Thank you for letting me do it. I'm so pleased to have done it.
Well, you've done a lovely job.
There are books here, and you're welcome to have them. I should say that it's going to be rather eccentric, because although I have a card reader, there are two good reasons why I'm not using this card reader. One is that the card reader is linked to my phone, and I left my phone at the airport this morning. And the second reason is that actually my card reader has something in common with Follain, who was sent at the age of around 16 to learn English. He was sent to Leeds in the north of England, where I come from. My father was just 2 years younger than Follain. I like to imagine my father and Follain. I like to imagine my father saying, no, don't cross the street now. The traffic comes in a different way. But Follain wouldn't have understood him anyway, because Follain resisted learning English. Because as far as Follain was concerned, this is un livre. It's not a book. It's un livre. You know, there is the object and there is the word for that object. And that's it. You can't just go calling things books. You can't just go calling arbor trees or pound bread or something like that. So he resisted it. Likewise, my card reader, which is linked to an English bank account, refuses to recognize any other currency except GBP.
Oh.
So we're going to have to do something.
What are we going to do?
Experimental. The books will be for sale. And if you have euros, then they're going to be about 10 or 12 euros each for cash. And I'm sure I can find a way of spending euros. And if you don't have cash, I'm suggesting we do this thing that in English country churches, if you sometimes go, and you find a guidebook, there's a little trust box, and you're supposed to put cash in. So basically, if you don't have cash, take the book. And if you remember, go online to the website and pay by PayPal at some later date. That's fine.
Can you pay with your IBAN number or your card as well? Do you have to use PayPal?
Well, from the website, there are PayPal buttons, but you can use credit cards. Yeah. Or send me an email if you just want to transfer the money and I'll give you the bank details or whatever. But it's basically, I quite like doing this, you know. No cards. Actually, not having my phone today has been
Can we write it on there?
quite liberating.
In the trust thing, can we
Oh, that's a good idea.
I'm going to give you, anybody who takes the book on trust, I'm going to give a card with the details to the website and all the rest of it. It's over to you. I mean, this is how the world should be working.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that, and I do hope you get your phone back. I remember one time that my phone went missing, and I used one of those Find My iPhone, and it was some parts in the west part of the city, and I had imagined kind of difficult negotiations, with a criminal gang, and what could I offer them in exchange, only to realize when I finally tracked it down that it was the police station. So I didn't have to bother with this. So I hope it won't be something like that. So I think just on behalf of the centre, on behalf of everyone here, I think we should applaud Kitty's achievement. This is the most remarkable piece of writing, but you can only truly appreciate that in English because of the extraordinary work that Kitty has done. So
Thank you.
and we did, of course,